So I would like to welcome you all to what I'm told is now the 47th My Life as Speaker. This is a wonderful, wonderful tradition that was started by Dean Howard Schneider, who's the head of the journalism school, some 7 years ago? No. 6 years ago. And what we try to do in these is to bring journalists and people who are involved in the information world to campus to talk about issues of interest, and also sometimes just to give you a sense of what it's like to do the jobs of journalism, and other times to sort of relate to some of the themes that we have in news literacy. I am Richard Hornick. I'm one of the lecturers in the School of Journalism, and I have been here for about 6 years, off and on. And our guest tonight is Keith Richburg, who was a foreign correspondent and at one point the foreign editor of the Washington Post, one of America's great newspapers. Keith was a foreign correspondent in Southeast Asia, in Africa. Most recently, he was Beijing bureau chief for the Washington Post. Keith and I first met in 1986 in Manila during a coup. Although I think we probably spent more time talking about the coup in a bar than actually on the street. But anyway, Keith is a terrific colleague, a longtime friend of mine. And he is going to talk tonight about a topic that is very important to me and very important to the course of news literacy, on the power of information and the new communication revolution that is changing the face of journalism and of the world. Keith is focusing on the impact of social media in China. So social media are things like Twitter. The great thing about Chinese is that you can have 140-character Twitter, but it's actually 140 words, not 140 letters, so you can write a whole lot more.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Thanks for having me here, Seawolves. The one thing Rick did not mention is that my fantasy baseball team is actually better than his fantasy baseball team, and we're actually playing each other this weekend, I think, so we'll see how that goes. But thanks very much. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about China, social media, the rise of social media, and how that's changed China and what we can expect for the future a little bit. I won't bore you. I'll talk a little bit here, 15 or so minutes, and then hopefully we'll have a little dialogue here and open it up, because I always find that I'm going to learn a lot more from you, probably from your questions, than I know about this topic. So it's always kind of interesting to hear what you want to know about. But first a little background, how I got involved in China and in the first place, and I'll show you why that's relevant in a minute. I made my first trip to China in 1985. That was way back when most people were still riding on bicycles there, and it was still a relatively poor place. I went there kind of completely by accident. I was going to visit some friends from college who were working in the foreign service over there, and they just invited me to come on a visit. So I got to see China in 1985, was immediately blown away and decided this is a place I kind of want to get back to and specialize. So I went back to Southeast Asia, spent a lot of time in Hong Kong. And then in 1995, I was asked to go and open a bureau in Hong Kong that would be there for the transition to China, which was in 1997 coming up. So I did that, and from Hong Kong, I was able to go in and out of China on a fairly regular basis. Beijing, Guangzhou, Shanghai, Kunming. The longest trip was probably about 7 or 8 weeks. The shortest trip was usually about 2 weeks. And so I got to really kind of see the change that had happened from '86. And then a stint back in, doing Iraq and Afghanistan, a stint back in Washington, D.C. as foreign editor, as Rick mentioned. And then I was in New York as the New York bureau chief for the Washington Post in 2009 when the foreign editor asked me if I want to go back to China. It was supposed to be a temporary gig, but I ended up back there for about 3.5 years. And so I had the vantage point of seeing China in the 80s, seeing it in the 90s, and then seeing it again in the 2000s. And obviously, I got to see that economic change as it was happening, but a lot of people always say, as a reporter, what was the biggest change that you were able to see or experience or witness there? And, without missing a beat, I always say Weibo, or social media. Weibo is Chinese Twitter, basically, although it's a catch-all phrase. There are several different Weibo companies. Sina Weibo is the most famous. There are several others involved. But I say it was the most fascinating change to me in China because it did several things at once. And I'll tell you first how I came about Weibo. I didn't really know much about it, and it was only coming in around 2009, which was good because my period in China coincided almost exactly with the rise of Weibo and social media there. I was in China, and as always, as a foreign correspondent, the first thing you do is look in the local newspapers as your tip sheet to try to find stories that you're going to write about. So I was flipping through a few Chinese papers there, and I saw a story out of Shanghai about a young man who was a driver. His name was Sun Zhangxie. He had actually been a driver for a private company. He was driving along the road one day on a delivery for his company, and someone flagged him down for a lift. So he gave this person a lift in his car, in his company truck, and a few meters down the road, he was stopped by the police who said, "You're operating as an illegal taxi." And he was fined, and he had his license taken away for a brief while. Now, because of this fine, he lost his job as a driver for this company. Now, he thought this was quite unfair, and he went to the courts for redress. He said, "Look, I was just giving somebody a lift who flagged me down. I'm not operating an illegal taxi." It turns out this was an entrapment scheme by the Shanghai police. They'd been doing this for hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of drivers, just kind of putting someone on the side of the road to flag them down, give them a lift, and then down the road they'd be stopped and ticketed for being an illegal taxi service. So this young man went to the courts. Of course, they wouldn't take any listen to him, threw his case out. So what happened was he took a pretty dramatic gesture. He stood in front of the courthouse and gathered a few local journalists around and chopped off his little finger. He chopped as a sign of protest. Now this sort of pretty dramatic protest probably had been going on for decades in China. The difference is we never would have heard about it before. And sitting in Beijing, all of a sudden this guy's story went viral. And I'm sitting in Beijing and I heard about it and I said, well, boy, I got to get down there and see what this was about. So I went down there and found other drivers who were standing outside the courthouse because of this one young man's dramatic gesture, who were out there protesting, demanding that the courts hear their case. And I wrote a story, basically in that story in late 2009, saying that something's changing in China because the courts eventually decided to rehear all of these cases and refund all of these fines that had been issued. And it was one of the few cases that anybody could remember where a popular protest organized by an ordinary person fighting against a perceived injustice kind of started something that was then later overturned by the court. So I thought this was something that was fascinating we were watching here. And so, that's why I say Weibo, to me, was something that dramatically changed what was going on in China. And it changed it in a couple of ways. And I was able to list about 5 specific ways that Weibo did manage to change China over the years. And I'm going to show you a couple of these websites. I'll explain that in a minute. Number one, it gave a voice to people who previously never really had a voice in terms of letting us know, letting us foreigner journalists know, letting the government know what they really thought. It gave a voice to people who had previously been voiceless. Number two, it allowed citizens to mobilize around a specific cause, whether that was consumer protection for food safety, whether it was the environment, whether it was searching for missing children. It allowed citizens in China to be able to mobilize themselves without the government around causes that they came together in this virtual online universe to try to resolve. Number three, Weibo allowed citizens for the first time to directly criticize the government. And this became very important because I was able to see later on, and I'll get into that later, how the government actually then began to monitor Weibo and use Weibo, especially on the local and provincial level. The Beijing government, for instance, told me just a few months ago that they now have a whole staff of people whose job is to do nothing but monitor what people are saying about the Beijing government on these websites and on Weibo so they can respond instantly, whether it's a bus that didn't come or a street that's flooded or any, a traffic light that's not working, up to more important things like pollution. So it gave people a way to criticize government or government inaction, and it gave the government a way to see what people are thinking. And the other avenue, the fourth thing I'll mention, which is kind of interesting, it created a way for ordinary people to expose evidence of corruption and with bypassing the official structure. The official structure in China is you go to your local petition office, and if you get no redress, you can try to make it up to the national petition office. Typically what would happen is people who went to their national petition office would be arrested and sent back to their localities. This gave people a way to expose corruption, particularly among local officials, and I'll get back to that in a minute as well. And then finally, and I think most importantly, Weibo, social media, Chinese Twitter, gave ordinary Chinese an alternative source of news and information outside of the control of the Communist Party. And I think that was relatively key because these days, most people I met and talked to who are under 30 or 35 years old said they get all of their news off of Weibo. They don't trust anything that's on the official government CCTV television channels, or they don't trust anything that's in the official newspapers, most of which get their information off of Xinhua. That I think is the most important, and that really, I go back to a turning point, and I call that the Wenzhou train crash. I don't know if you're familiar with that. Two high-speed trains collided in Wenzhou, just south of Shanghai, in July of 2011. And I went back, there's a website, this is what I have up here. This website 1 year later went back and tried to reconstruct the story of the Wenzhou train crash. And the reason this is interesting is it gives us a blow-by-blow of what we were able to know and when we were able to know it. I'll just put this up. If I can do that here. Yeah, what you can see, it's a little hard to read from where you are, but the most important thing is what you can see here is that the first reports about what happened on the train did not come out from Xinhua, it came out from people on the train. Now that might not be that unusual here because we're used to that here where people with cell phones are doing things. This was fascinating. And it was basically an hour before we got any official word that anything had happened. And some of these were reading things like, we're in the train, the first train had a bad accident in Wenzhou, the train did an emergency brake followed by a violent crash, there were 2 more collisions, the electricity across the entire train has gone out, I'm in the last carriage, thank God I'm fine, this is too terrifying. That went out at 8:38, 4 minutes after the accident. The next message here that went out at 8:47, that's 13 minutes after the accident, that's the one at the bottom. It says, a cry for help, train D301 has been derailed not far from Wenzhou Station. Children are crying up and down the carriage and not one member of the staff has come to help. Hurry, hurry and save us. Hurry up and save us. So, this goes on and on. I don't need to read all of these, but it's absolutely fascinating chronology. And it was a very, very, very long time before Xinhua, the official news agency, actually came out and even put out a bulletin saying a train had crashed. And this went on later. We can talk about it later if you're interested. There were allegations of a cover-up, but this was, to me, the first example of how the citizens were out reporting something that the officials did not necessarily want reported. I was able to see many, many more examples of that. But skipping right ahead, there were a couple other really good examples. I mentioned exposing corruption. That's become a very, very big area for average citizens to expose local level corruption. Now there seems to be a big line in China between local level and national level. National level still seems to be a bit off limits, but local so-called citizen journalists have been going with great guns trying to expose what local officials are doing. There's a really good example here of an official who was basically spotted at official functions wearing expensive wristwatches. Now on a government salary in China, you shouldn't be able to afford these things, but I thought this was quite good. Let me see if I can get him here. Now you can see, this is a website here where they actually took official pictures of this guy that had appeared in the official media and circled his wristwatches here, all of which are kind of Cartier and Rolex. I thought these were great. It showed him at official meetings here. This was fantastic. As a result, this guy got fired. This guy lost his job. Now that was an example of how citizens were able to expose, just through Weibo, through the social media, what they considered an affront. So there are many, many more examples of this. The other thing I mentioned in here is how Weibo became an area for people to kind of gather around a cause. One of the big, and these are usually causes that are not specifically a challenge to the government per se. The environment is one, pollution in Beijing. But a big one was food safety. And a couple of years ago, a young student at Fudan University in Shanghai got so disgusted about reading stories about food safety that he decided to set up a website that would be a map of the country where anybody could put food safety information from their area. He would try to verify it first, and usually verify it from an official media source. And he started his own website, the Chinese acronym for which is called Throw It Out the Window, a phrase he claims he got from Teddy Roosevelt. Let me see if I can find it. This is his site. It's in Chinese, but what it does is it actually shows you in real time where all the food safety scares are in China. It's a fantastic site, and it's completely done by volunteers from all over the country who just send in the information. And you can click on your province or your area and see what the latest food safety scandal is, whether it's pigs floating in the river in Shanghai or dead ducks in Wenzhou. He was actually called in by the Shanghai government. I was talking to him one day, and he was actually called in by the Shanghai government. He was quite afraid that he was going to be put in jail or called on the carpet. So what he immediately did was put out or tweet out on his Weibo account that he was being called in by the Shanghai government. This got retweeted millions of times around China. This actually happened while I was talking to him. So by the time he actually went in for his scheduled meeting the next day, they had no idea what to do in the Shanghai government, so they just thanked him for putting up his site and said they were willing to work with him any way they could. So that shows you the power of Weibo. Now, the other thing people always ask, and it's absolutely true, do they try to block what's on Weibo? And it's absolutely true. They try to block the search engines. They try to block it not by blocking the site itself, but by putting it incumbent upon the host companies for these sites, which are private businesses. They basically give them a list, literally. They will email them a list of search terms that are to be blocked. They will email them a list of sensitive topics, and it's up to the company. It becomes incumbent upon the company to try to block those search terms. If you want to know what terms are being blocked on Weibo, you can actually do it in real time. There's a site that does this. It's in English. It's called greatfire.org. Great Fire is one word. I think I've got that up here. Just wanted to show you that. You can go on here yourself. You can type in any phrase, and you can see you can type in Dalai Lama, and it'll actually tell you which sites it's being blocked on, how it works. So it's greatfire.org. Highly recommended if you're interested in this topic. In fact, let's try to see if there's something that's being blocked right now. Let's try Falun Gong. So that should, it takes a while to kind of go through and search all of the engines. Oh, what's it say here? Falun Gong. Yep, it shows that it shows you three different sites. It's been blocked 67% of the time on one site and 100% of the time on those other two sites. So it's in real time. It'll tell you how much since April or May of 2012 that the term Falun Gong has been blocked. So you can go on there, you can type in anything. Just have a lot of fun to play with that, by the way. You can have a blast. I'll just go on to say there's another thing. How has the Chinese government reacted to this growth of social media, which I think is absolutely fascinating. I'll just go through that, and then I think that we can open it up for some questions and dialogue. The Chinese government reaction has been very ambivalent. It's swung between repression and acceptance, or as I put it another way, trying to rein it in or trying to join it. If you can't beat them, join them. On the side of repression, they've instituted some new laws, and it's going up the scale of repression, starting, number one, with real name registration. It may not sound like a big deal, but in China, in the past, historically, with this thing, which is not very old, you've been able to actually register using a pseudonym. And once you start requiring people to use their real name with their real ID card number, that means that you can be tracked and traced for something you put up there that might be politically sensitive. The number two, and following that up the scale, higher up in the repression scale, you can actually be arrested. Now, there have been several bloggers who have been arrested. Some have been sent to this re-education through labor camp system, all for jokes, cartoons, or things that they put up on Weibo. And then finally, the other thing they can do, they can shut down sites, and they have shut down some people's Weibo sites. That has worked in some degree, but people also have multiple sites. And sometimes people just change their name or go onto another server because there are many companies that host these kind of social media sites. So it's almost like a cat and mouse game of trying to squeeze toothpaste back in a tube. These guys, and most of these guys who are very avid bloggers often have 7 or 8 Weibo sites. So shutting one site down often means the person will just move on to another site. So those are some of the things they've been doing. The question has been asked, why don't they just shut it down altogether? I don't see that's happening, and most people I've talked to don't see that happening because Weibo has become extremely, extremely popular. There's something like 300 million active Weibo users. That's 300 million. That's about the population of the United States, out of a total internet user population of about 500 million, which is huge. And most of those are actually sports stars, entertainers who have Weibo sites, and people are on there their followers are trying to see what they're up to. And so most people aren't on there talking about political issues at all. On the other hand, I think they're afraid if they try to just shut down Weibo, they're taking away this thing that's become so embedded into the popular consciousness now that would really start a backlash against the government. So the flip side of that repression is they're trying to join it. The government has realized, look, we better get into that space. And they've done a couple of things. Number one, they've started what's called the 50-cent party. It's called that because they basically pay people 50 cents a posting to go onto these Weibo sites and post pro-government tweets. So all of a sudden, if somebody's putting something anti-government out, you'll see 100 people suddenly putting out pro-government messages. Those are known as the 50-cent party tweets. Nobody believes they're real, but they're into that's the way they're trying to get into that space and kind of tilt the debate the other direction. The other thing they have done is they've encouraged all the ministries, the police departments, everybody to get into that space with their own Weibo sites and start putting out pro-government messages, which has happened. The first ministry level person was a provincial chief in Xinjiang who started his own Weibo site a few years ago. Now a lot of them have their own Weibo sites. Wang Yang, who was Guangdong Party secretary before he just got promoted last year, had his own Weibo site. And the other thing they started doing is even Xi Jinping, who just took over as party general secretary and most recently elevated to president, there's a mysterious Weibo site that started for Xi Jinping. It's called Fans of Xi Jinping website. Now this is something really unusual because with communist leaders in China, we almost never know anything about them, their background or anything else. And all of a sudden, after Xi Jinping was selected, I won't say elected, you started getting these sort of pro-Xi websites popping up. And I'll put that up as the last one. It's kind of fun. These are very rare family photos of Xi Jinping. Now, I tried to go down and find the guy who did this, and of course, once we found him by telephone, he insisted he had nothing to do with the government. We said, well, who are you? He said, oh, I am just an ordinary Chinese citizen, and he would not say how he got these rare photographs of Xi Jinping's family. Let's see if I can find some of these here. This is Xi Jinping in his younger days here. These are all off the website, by the way. Xi Jinping from the early years. Xi Jinping with Jiang Zemin earlier on. This is the cave where Xi Jinping had to live during the Cultural Revolution. I think there's one more. There's Xi Jinping as a young man. I think he was a college student there. And there's some very, very rare family photographs here. And on the website, it actually had the caption said, we love Ping Ping, as they called him. and as I said, we tried to track this guy down. We figured this had to be done by Xi Jinping's propaganda people. He said, oh, no, we're just an ordinary Chinese citizen. We just love Xi Jinping. So that's what I mean by an example of how they're trying to get into that space, because they've kind of recognized that Weibo is a way to reach people. So, in summary, people always ask, is Weibo going to change China? Is it going to democratize China? And I think that's asking the wrong question. I think the thing is, Weibo has already changed China in the ways that I've mentioned. It's made the government more accountable. It's made government have to take account of public opinion. It's given a voice to people who have never had a voice before. And it's given people a real alternative source of information. Now, where that leads is something we have to be watching over the next years or so. And I think, we're already seeing the government is starting to react to it because they recognize what a powerful force that is. So I'm going to stop there because I know you guys probably have a lot more things you want to talk about. We can talk about this or many other things. We can leave Ping Ping up in the back if you'd like. Over here. Yeah, over here. Let's see.
So, Keith, how can the government begin to take control? I mean, they've also begun to hire lots of propaganda experts, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're really ramping this thing up.
Mm-hmm.
Is there such lack of belief in anything the government does that by definition anything they do will be discounted by the public at this point?
I've been really surprised at the level of cynicism there. You've been there. We always kind of had the impression that there was at least a certain segment of the population there that would just kind of follow along whatever was going on. Oh, is this one on too? Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah. I was amazed that no matter what the government puts out, the level of cynical attacks that comes out on Weibo is, to me, mind-boggling sometimes. Now, as journalists and foreigners watching this, we have to be a little bit careful. The Weibo audience is not all of China. It's more urban, it's younger, it's wired. On the other hand, it does give us a glimpse into what a young urban population is thinking, and they are incredibly cynical about almost everything. And I think the government is on its back foot about this thing. On the one hand, they don't quite know how to deal with this, and almost everything they do instantly gets attacked. I'll give you just one example. Gary Locke is the U.S. ambassador there. He showed up and caused quite...
Chinese-American.
Chinese-American, first Chinese-American ambassador to China. He caused quite a stir when he first showed up because he was photographed carrying a backpack and he was holding his little daughter's hand and he was buying a coffee at a Starbucks using a coupon. And this picture went viral in China because, and on Weibo, people were saying things like, why would a U.S. ambassador be carrying his own backpack? He should have people carrying his backpack. And why was he using a coupon? The Starbucks should give him a coffee. And then Gary Locke came to China and he went to see the Great Wall with his family, and he did something that no Chinese leader would ever do. He waited in line to buy a ticket like everybody else. And this was shocking in China. Chinese loved it. And the government started getting really kind of pissed off about this, right? And so four newspapers in Beijing ran what obviously was a planted editorial because it all came out the same day. And they all started saying, who is this Gary Locke think he is, trying to pretend to be a common man? Why doesn't Gary Locke show how much he's really worth? He's pretending to be common and pretending to be poor. So the U.S. Embassy, which has its own Weibo account, by the way, read this thing, and they immediately put out Gary Locke's, income statement and financial asset statement. And in addition, they put out Joe Biden's financial asset statements and Barack Obama's financial statements, saying some people have asked to see Gary Locke's. Well, it's all public information in the United States. Here it is. The backlash against this was everybody then went on Weibo and said, oh my God, this is all public information. Why don't we see the financial asset statements from our prime minister and our president? So immediately, these editorials completely disappeared out of the newspapers. If you went back and tried to find these editorials that had appeared in all four Beijing newspapers, they were scrubbed off the website completely. So that's an example of the cynicism, of the public.
Yeah, I mean, the Chinese have been, they were used to not really believing what was in the papers, but they weren't sure what the alternatives were. But the government does, or the official media do seem to be trying a bit harder to become more credible.
That's right.
That now that they know that there's some check outside. Do you think Xinhua has improved because of Weibo? I mean, are the official media actually getting better?
Yeah, some official media has gotten better. I don't think Xinhua necessarily has improved because that's kind of the official line of the party. But there are some government-owned papers like Global Times, which is the tabloid newspaper, very nationalistic tabloid, owned by the Communist Party. It's owned by People's Daily. And I talked to the editor, who was a friend of mine, and he described his own job. And he basically said, look, I've got two masters. I've got the party on one side telling me what to do, but on the other hand, I have the market. I have to sell this paper. And if I don't put stories in it that people believe, then nobody's going to buy this paper. So he said, it's a constant tug of war. He's always putting things in, and then he said he always goes to sleep in fear of that phone call at night saying, what the hell are you doing? So I think some of the journalists are brave, and they are trying to push the envelope of things, and then they get reined back in a little bit. But they actually recognize, there's some areas where they can be a little bit more aggressive. If you're writing about the environment, it's okay. If you're writing about pigs floating down the river in Shanghai, that's kind of okay. If you're writing about local level corruption, like the fellow with the watches, that's kind of okay as long as it's local level, but the Shanghai media won't do it. It'll be media from another province that'll do it.
Okay, so social media, Weibo, Twitter here in the United States, all absolutely perfect. It's great. Nothing but good things come from it. The people never do anything bad. They never start rumors. They never go after innocent people, right?
And exactly the reverse. There's a lot of rumors out there. The problem in all authoritarian countries I've found is when there's a dearth of real accurate information you can trust, people go to rumors. And it's hard and people are willing to believe every conspiracy theory. And they're like here with Twitter, there are also scams that can start on Weibo and Twitter. And they have what they call human flesh searches, which is if there's someone who's an actor or a sports celebrity who says something that the Chinese don't like, if they criticize China, if they're outside of China, for example, the netizens, as the internet users are called there, will instantly go on and find out everything about them, where they slept last week, what food they ate, what kind of car they're driving. They've actually harassed people by putting their personal email address and phone numbers on Weibo just to criticize them. Every time the Chinese government has put in some of these regulations to try to control Weibo, they've always done it under the heading of trying to control rumor mongering and trying to crack down on what they call pornography by blocking access to certain sites. So there is a downside to Weibo as well. So it's something that the government uses. And interestingly enough, when the British phone hacking scandal happened, that story got huge play in the official Chinese media because they used that then in their editorials to say, aha, you see, this is an excuse to try to crack down on the media and try to crack down on social networking sites.
And also, things like nationalism can get out of hand too, right? And a lot of the most virulent anti-Japanese stuff, there's a big controversy going on between Japan and China right now, and in China some of the anti-Japanese sentiment has gotten sort of out of hand, and a lot of that was inflamed by Weibo as well.
Absolutely. You can stir up anti-Japanese feeling there at the drop of a hat, and it's something that you always see kind of whipped up at the time of political turmoil in China when they're trying to deflect attention from corruption issues or their own internal problems. What's a handy foil? Oh, let's go beat up on the Japanese. But people are getting a little bit more sophisticated. People still get on the streets about Japan, and there is a very deep-seated anti-Japanese feeling there. On the other hand, people know sometimes that they're being manipulated, and some of the cartoonists put their work on Weibo because they actually can't get published in traditional media that are afraid to publish these political cartoons. And one of these cartoons showed a Chinese official who was asking his secretary, saying, "Oh look, there are anti-Japanese demonstrations outside. Give me a checklist." And she does a checklist, and she said, "Let's see, your watch is from Switzerland, your suit's from Britain, your car is from Germany, and your mistress is from Taiwan. Oh great, nothing Japanese. Let's go out and fight the Japanese."
So let's have some questions from the floor. As I said, anything on Weibo, on social media. For those of you who are taking news literacy, this stuff is really, we go back to that first, one of those early lectures on the power of information, and Napoleon saying that he feared 4 newspapers more than 1,000 bayonets or whatever. Now it's the opposite in some ways. You don't have 4 newspapers anymore. You have 300 million Weibo. It's really has a game changer. I was Beijing bureau chief for Time from 1985 to 87. And I have to agree that this is by far the biggest thing that I've seen from economically it's changed a lot, but from a socio-political point of view, there's nothing even close. So.
Hi. Hi, my name is John. I just wanted to ask, what features are you hoping Weibo will add in the future, and do you think that there is a possibility that they will add those features?
What features will add? Yeah.
Right.
Well, that's a good question. I think, the government right now is trying to control it and rein it in by getting people to do real name registration, and they're trying to kind of contain the space. I think one of the things, let me add one thing. The Great Firewall, as it's called, is the censorship system that's in place now. Weibo right now can easily be at least certain sites can be shut down or certain search terms can be shut down, although people have found ways to get around that. I don't know the technology. Oh, great, have the lights on, I can see you. I don't know the technology behind that, but it'd be great if Weibo could find ways to circumvent the Great Firewall a bit more. I think at the moment, the government's winning that battle between the people who are finding ways around the Great Firewall and building the firewall higher and higher. I'd like to see more features where people can sort of get through that firewall, or it can become more instantaneous. And so even, if you could tweet out something that was blocked, it could still get to people if they knew how to get it. I don't know the technology behind that. I think people are working on that all the time. It really is like a cat and mouse game. And just interestingly enough, one thing that they actually do is Chinese are very smart about finding ways to get around the censorship. So if a word or a term is censored, they'll find a word that sounds like the word, or maybe it's the same word but a different character in Chinese to use that. Yeah, exactly. And so like Ai Weiwei, for example, his name basically means, Ai Weiwei, the artist dissident who was under arrest, his name basically can mean, if you pronounced a certain way, love the future. And so all of a sudden these tweets started coming out on Weibo about, I wonder what the future holds, or I wonder where the future is. So people have clever ways of getting around things.
But
Thank you.
one of the features that I saw in, I think it was last fall, they've started using geolocation tags.
Yeah.
So you get a map, and you can say, I'm here, and there's a pollution problem here, so it really has become a sort of crowdsourcing thing as well.
Absolutely. And by the way, they were they were really innovative in China. They actually had photos on Weibo before they did on Twitter. They actually started that.
Right there.
Yeah.
My name's Ethan. I'm a junior here at this school.
Hi.
I was wondering, was the sentiment in China towards America right now? I know there are hackers who try to attack our government, but does that mean that they're just wary of America, or that there's more of a deep-seated kind of derision?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. I actually... Yeah, the question was, what do Chinese think of America right now? I mean, there are hackers who have tried to break into our systems over here, and just wondering what the sentiment is about China. That's a great question, and it really depends on who you ask. I mean, China's a pretty vast country, so anything you say is going to automatically be a generalization. But I think it'd be fair to say that the average person likes America, they respect America. There are a million Chinese coming to study in our universities. This is still a place that people want to come. They want to know. They want our technology. Apple iPhones sell more there. General Motors sells more cars in China than they sell in the United States. So they love our products. I think on a government level, the average person who thinks about these things would probably not like the fact that we're involved in wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. There was a deep-seated feeling that the bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade in 1998-99 was not an accident. In 2001, in April, there was a collision of a U.S. spy plane with a Chinese jet over Hainan Island that killed a Chinese pilot. And I think people believe that was an invasion of their airspace. So there is some idea that the U.S. government wants to contain China's rise, that China is an inevitable rising power, that they're at some point going to overtake the United States as an economic power, and that the U.S. government is trying to encircle China through things like the announced pivot to Asia, putting U.S. troops in Australia at these bases, announcing our military forward position in Asia after we withdraw from Afghanistan and Iraq. So a lot of people fear that we don't want China to rise. On the other hand, I was there during the U.S. presidential election here, and Chinese in huge numbers watched the debates between Obama and Romney on the internet. These were streamed live on the internet in China, and millions of people were watching this. And I read the comments after the debate were fascinating, and they said, we really wish we could have something like this. They were amazed that the President of the United States has to stand up and listen to criticism in his face, and they were just saying, when can we have something like that? So there's a real admiration for our system of government and the idea that we have elections. And a lot of people were saying, I wish I could see the day when we could have something like this in our country.
Yeah, thank you.
Sure.
Hi,
Welcome.
my name's Matt. I'm a journalism major. I actually wanted to ask about your experience in Africa.
Sure.
And were there things that you saw there that resonate with you today, and anything that did you see anything that affected how you are today?
Well, that's good. My experiences in Africa as a correspondent. I could say, go on Amazon.com and buy my book, which is called Out of America, A Black Man Confronts Africa. I was there at a particularly bad time for Africa. I was there during the Civil War in Sudan, the Civil War in Somalia, and the genocide in Rwanda. So I was there when a lot of people had great hope that there was going to be this democratic wave sweeping through Africa, and that after Eastern Europe became democratic, that the countries in Africa would have these kind of democratic revolutions. And we saw dictators overthrown in Somalia with Siad Barre and with Haile Mariam in Ethiopia, and we thought there would be democratic governments come along. Uganda was always hailed as a possible democratic leader. On the other hand, what we saw is, Museveni is still there in Uganda. Somalia is still a mess. Ethiopia, the dictator was still there until he died in office, and now someone else has taken over. They just had the first real, I think, democratic transition in Kenya after a kind of a messy election process last time, where a guy who lost ended up in the power. And so I think, I was there at a pretty bad time. I think it's actually a much better place now in terms of, there are more countries now that are democratic in terms of having elections, and the economies are doing a lot better, which is the main thing. A lot of that actually is because of Chinese investment in Africa. I've talked to a lot of people. A lot of Americans always think that the Chinese have to be up to no good in Africa because, it's neocolonialism. They're only going there to take their resources. But, when I talk to Africans, they always tell me that, look, the roads are being built, the economies are growing, the markets are filled with Chinese goods, so they see Chinese investment in Africa as a good thing. So, I think I'd need to go back, because that book came out in 1997, and it was based on that particular period of time. I think I need to go back now and write something else about how the Chinese investment there has changed. And I think on the governmental front, there are a lot more countries, as I said, that are democratic. There's still too many people dying in places like Eastern Congo. And so I think it's a mixed picture, but overall the trend is a lot more optimistic than it was before. So I'm a little bit more optimistic than I was. But out of America, a black man confronts Africa.
Great book.
My name is Matthew.
Hi, Matt.
Currently taking news literacy. With the censorship on Baidu and Chinese government watching over what's actually put on the internet, is it hard to find viable and credible information in China? And how credible is the actual information? Since they're censoring it, the information that you're getting, since it's so small and minute, is that really credible? Or do you really have to dive deep into the culture and deep into the community to see what's going on?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, you mean for Chinese or for?
Chinese.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. For the very, very small number who read English, they can have access to English language websites. Like the New York Times piece on the Prime Minister's wealth was picked up and they'll get retranslated into Chinese. That obviously would be something that the Chinese government wants to block. But the Chinese are very, very cynical, and they're very good consumers. They don't believe a lot of the official government information that's coming out, and Weibo, as I mentioned, has become an alternative source of news and information. I saw this, for example, during the tsunami and the Fukushima nuclear crisis in Japan. That was the earthquake that then started this nuclear crisis at the Fukushima nuclear plant. There was a lot of concern in China about nuclear waste or the wind blowing a nuclear cloud across the East China Sea into China, and also some concern that the Chinese nuclear plants may not be safe. China has a lot of fault lines. We just saw an earthquake in Sichuan very recently, and there are a lot of nuclear plants in China. So what happened in Japan was you had this earthquake caused these fissures in this nuclear power plant at Fukushima. So a lot of people went on the internet and started demanding to know whether the Chinese plants were safe. And by the way, there was a lot of admiration for how the Japanese were able to evacuate that area around that nuclear plant. So a lot of people were saying, can China do the same thing? Where are the evacuation plans for our nuclear plant? The government started through their propaganda organs, which is mainly Xinhua, the main news agency, will put out editorials and statements and order all the newspapers to carry these. And they started putting out these statements saying, Chinese nuclear plants are nothing like the Japanese nuclear plants, they're all safe. Nobody believed them. And they started putting out statements saying, we've tested the air for radiation, nothing is coming over from Japan, the food coming in from Japan is still safe, etc. Nobody believed them, because these people were still taking the Weibo and putting out alternative information saying, we can't trust it, we don't know that's real, where are the evacuation plans for our plants? And it forced the state council in China to actually suspend all new licenses for nuclear plants for a while and make a visible show of going around and inspecting nuclear plants to show they were safe. So I guess the moral is that even though the government tries to control information, people always have alternative sources, and they talk to each other and they start putting out news and information from foreign sources and elsewhere. So it's a trick. But the funny thing is, I don't think many people, except real hardcore government supporters, believe everything that's in the official media now. Does that answer your question?
Yes. So would you say, they say a lie travels faster than the truth. Do you think that word of mouth travels faster than the internet?
Word of mouth matters for a lot now. The problem with that is, though, there are a lot of rumors that go around there. And as we mentioned earlier, there's a lot of unverifiable stuff out there. There's a lot of misinformation floating around as well. So there is kind of a news vacuum. There are certain organizations that do independent reporting, like Caixin, Southern Weekend, which is a newspaper based out of Guangdong. The Guangdong Southern Chinese newspapers are closer to Hong Kong, so they've got a little bit more of an independent tradition. So if they report something, people are more likely to believe it. If Xinhua reports it, they're not. So people are pretty discerning in where the news comes from. CCTV, which is the official television channel, nobody believes the news out of that. They use that to watch the New Year's show and entertainment.
But yeah, it's a good point though, because you have, here we have Twitter, and there's a lot of news gets generated, but then there's no follow-up. I mean, the follow-up then comes from the old mainstream media, and there are places to go. But I think the point is, yeah, you've got Weibo, and then there's not much else. So you have the wisdom or insanity of the crowds, and nothing that you can rely on.
Yeah, there's no official media to come in and say this is right, this is not right.
Hello, my name is Brian, and
Hi.
I want to say that I use Weibo every day. It's a great
right.
part of my life. So I was wondering, Weibo has become a great platform for the Western media to know about China, know about the true China, know about what's going on. Do you think that there might be a selection of news when it comes to news about China that Western media tend to focus on? Because, for example, there's this recent violent incident in the Xinjiang province where the Uyghur, I don't know what do you call them, extremists or social activists decided to attack the policemen and kill a whole bunch of them. For that kind of information, I would say that it sort of contrary the belief of general reporting on Chinese cultural policy, like the Chinese government usually generally just suppress the minority. But in this instance, the U.S. White House Speaker Carney made a statement about urging the Chinese government to investigate, clear what's going on in this place and give justice to the Uyghur people and the Han people. So the Chinese response on Weibo to this statement is that how come in Boston this is considered terrorism? How come this in China it is considered government suppression? Do you think that the U.S. selection of Chinese news tend to support a certain tendency to focus on a certain image of the Chinese government or something like that?
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. And it's the old problem, one man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist. It's in many ways it's the exact same way we looked at the Chechnya issue with Russia, where are they people being suppressed by the Russian government, or are they a bunch of terrorists and the Russian government's trying to restore order? So it really is the way you look at the issue. I was there in China when they had this big blow up in Xinjiang a few years ago, and riots basically, where it was very bloody riots where Muslims were attacking Han Chinese were attacking Muslims, and the only trouble the Washington Post got into with the Chinese government is when they thought we were reporting that story too sympathetic towards the Uyghurs, the Muslims. So it's a delicate area. If the question is whether the U.S. media doesn't approach that story with the proper balance, I think that's probably a fair question to ask.
The fairness and balance of the news stories?
Yeah, because the problem is we're not allowed to actually go there and independently report, is the main thing. And I'd argue the same thing with Tibet going on, where there have been I think over 100 self-immolations, people setting themselves on fire. The Chinese government says these people are being instigated to do this by the Dalai Lama. The Tibetans tell us from their exile groups that they're doing this because they're frustrated with Chinese government rule. It's hard for us because as foreigners, we're not allowed to just go there and walk around and talk to people. We're restricted from going there, so we're forced to get our information from exile groups and human rights groups and others. I've said this to the Chinese government foreign ministry myself in person in a press conference like this when they were criticizing me for the way we cover the situation in Tibet and in Xinjiang where the Uyghurs are. I said, I agree, we're not doing a good job reporting it, so why don't you let us go? Just let us go and don't follow us around and give us the freedom to go and report and do what we want. Then maybe we can give more balanced stories about what the real situation is. But I think that's partly a problem of the government trying to control the flow of information. They want us to report the story as, terrorists attacking China. And they did a pretty good job. After September 11th, they wanted to have the the Uyghur groups, the East Turkestan Liberation Organization, labeled a terrorist group, and I think George Bush did label them a terrorist group in exchange for Chinese cooperation after 9/11, and they wanted to make sure that they linked that group in China to Al-Qaeda. So it's a big question, because then there are some human rights groups in this country who say, no, that's a separate case, because that was a traditional Muslim homeland. A lot of Han Chinese migrants started moving into it, and now the Han Chinese actually outnumber the indigenous Muslim Uyghurs. And so it's a very complicated situation. I don't think we probably do a good enough job of explaining the kind of delicate balance there. But part of that, as I said, is we can't get there.
Yeah, okay, we should move on. We've got quite a few people.
I'll try to be shorter. That's a complicated issue.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm a Chinese student here
Hi.
studying journalism.
Hi, welcome.
Every time I read like American newspaper, I will find there's lots of like negative image about China. And sometimes I talk to my American friends. They feel, I got that kind of feeling that they feel once they enter in China, they're gonna die. And I just wanna know, like, and also like in our news literacy class, we talk about censorship, you know, all those bad things about China. I don't think it's like the full image of China. And I wanna know, like, for Americans, what's the value for them to study China or, you know, Chinese media?
Thank you for the question. I'm not sure. Yeah, I think you're reading the wrong newspapers then, if you think you're getting only a negative image of China. I think I think if you read the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, you get a pretty balanced picture of what's going on in China. I mean, for every story we write about censorship, we're also writing stories about how Chinese are buying more American cars than ever, about how the Chinese and the Americans just restored military-to-military contacts for the first time in a while. We did an enormous amount of coverage for the Washington Post on Xi Jinping's election and on the party Congress leading up to that, including his anti-corruption campaign that he started. So yes, we're going to write about the censorship issues because those are things that the Chinese people care about. There were, hundreds and hundreds of people outside the offices of Southern Weekend magazine or newspaper or weekly newspaper in Guangdong protesting against censorship. So obviously that's something Chinese care about. So we're going to write about it if that's something that people are protesting about. But we also write a lot of economic stories about China as well. We write about the business stories. We write about Chinese companies like Weibo that are going, global. So, I think there's a good balance of stories about China. Anytime, I think a part of that's a problem of the news media itself. I mean, almost every country we write about or everything we write about in a newspaper is almost by definition negative. If you ask President Obama, he'd probably say, why do you always write negative stories about my administration? I mean, everybody thinks we write negative stories about them, and that's kind of what journalists do. I mean, we're kind of in the business of writing things that aren't working or stories that are negative. I remember going to the...
Good news is no news.
Good news is no news. I remember I used to live in the Philippines, and after living there, it was a really tumultuous place. There were coup attempts and bombings and all this. And then after a while, it got pretty boring. A president named Ramos was elected, and sort of nothing was really going on. The economy was growing in the Philippines, and I hadn't gone back in many years. So I went back a few years later, and I went to interview the president, and President Ramos. And he remembered me from the old days during the coup attempts. And I said, "Oh, President Ramos, how are you, sir? I haven't been here in a while." And he said, "Yes, I know. That's very good." He said, "The best thing I did for the Philippines was get the Philippines off the front page of the Washington Post." So, I mean, we always write bad news stories about things in a way. So I think that's maybe some of what you're seeing. If there's a cyber attack or some conflict between the U.S. and China, we often write about that. No?
Hello, I'm a junior student, journalism minor.
How are you?
Thanks for your impressive speech tonight. I just would like to ask this one question.
Sure.
What do you think is the major difference between Chinese American people in response to the major exposure in like social media like Facebook and like Weibo? I mean, they take actions and they show their anger sometimes, but what would differentiate Chinese from like other people from other nations like America?
Oh, that's a good question. I think you're just making me think about this now. I would think in the United States, we've had all kinds of ways to vent our anger for a long time in many different formats. Just listen to talk radio. sometime and listen to some of the people who call in to talk radio, or go out in the middle of Harvard Square in Cambridge and listen to people shouting. I think for China, this is a new thing for people to have a forum where they can openly vent their anger and frustration at the government. That's something that's new that we haven't seen before. I think in this country we've been venting our anger at the government for a long time. And it reminds me of an old joke of the Chinese and American who meet somewhere in a bar, and the American says, "I have freedom of the press." And the Chinese says, "What do you mean?" "I have freedom of speech." And the Chinese says, "What do you mean?" And the American says, anytime I want, I can go to the front gates of the White House and scream, "Obama is an idiot." And the Chinese says, "Well, we have freedom of the press and freedom of the speech too." And the American says, "What do you mean?" And the Chinese guy says, "Anytime I want to, I can get on a plane, I can fly to Washington, I can walk to the White House, and I can shout, 'Obama's an idiot.'" Hope that answers you.
It is, I mean, one of the great things about Weibo, and one of the reasons the government, I think, is so conflicted, is that it is a great safety valve.
It is. It lets people let off steam.
I mean, we were there in '89, and nobody had the chance to let off steam before '89 in Tiananmen, and sometimes it's a good safety valve.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Helen. I was just wondering, do you think social media could ever replace newspapers?
Can social media what?
Replace newspapers?
Well, replace newspapers. I don't know if social media can, but I think the internet is already replacing newspapers. I think the problem with social media is, and this is a really big topic, but I think the problem with social media is there's still a lot of stuff out there that we can't verify, that's not true, that's not written by professional journalists. And so you, as a consumer, social media really to me is just a platform for information. It's like a big highway with all this information going across it, and you as the consumer have to know what to pull out. If you're reading Twitter, for example, here, during something like the Boston bombings. I was in Boston during the marathon bombings, and there was all kinds of nonsense going across Twitter. But you had to follow the Boston police Twitter site, follow certain Boston news organization websites, because they're probably reporting relatively accurate information. Ignore all this other nonsense. The same with Weibo in China. There's all kinds of stuff going across the transit, so you have to know what to watch on it. But newspapers, I think, still play a role. I think it's replacing newspapers in China for young people as a source of information, but the newspapers are trying to get better so they don't lose the niche that they have. I mentioned Global Times as one, so I think you might see some newspapers change within the leeway the government gives them to try to start reporting on some of these issues, like the environment being one. Hope that helps.
Yeah.
Yes.
Hi, my question is kind of just on social networking in general. When you talk about, the train crash and something like the Boston bombing, it went viral immediately, and everyone was using hashtags and, mentioning people. In about 10 years, if we, God forbid, have another terror attack or another train crash happens, what effect will social media have on the news in whole in about 10 years? Or five.
What happen 10 years from now?
10 years from now, wow, I wish I had a crystal ball. I thought the Boston.
How about 1 year from now?
Well, 1 year from now, yeah.
6 months.
I just between now and the end of tomorrow. Yeah, I just thought the Boston Marathon bombing was a classic example of how that story was really covered off of new media, off of Twitter, and they actually caught the suspects mainly because of Facebook, and everybody with a digital camera who had taken a picture posted those pictures on Facebook, and the police were able to reconstruct who these guys were and where they were standing and how they got away. And that was all because they just asked everybody, if you took a picture, please send it in, and people were posting pictures around, so that was fascinating. We've seen some of that in China. I mentioned missing children. I didn't have time to get into everything, but there was a campaign where some guy's son was kidnapped, a little toddler was kidnapped by these people who go around in China kidnapping babies. He couldn't get the police in his village to help him at all, and he happened to run across a journalist who then put this out on Weibo and social media. They found that kid 2,000 miles away, because that kid's picture got retweeted around, and somebody saw that kid in another town thousands of miles away, and it was a happy story. He was reunited with his dad. And on the other hand, that undercut what the police should have been doing to search for that kid. So you're actually starting to see already social media taking on a larger and larger role. I just mentioned that before, there was an earthquake just a week or so ago in Sichuan. As far as I know, people aren't really giving money to the Red Cross because they don't trust it because of a scandal that happened a couple of years ago, which I won't get into. But on the other hand, actors, sports stars, they're starting to set up Weibo accounts to collect money, and people are going to be doing things and volunteering through Weibo. So you're actually starting to see, as I mentioned before, social media being an organizing tool for people who do want to help out in situations like this. In Boston as well, I mean, they just raised $20 million for the fund to help the Boston victims, almost all through just social media, Weibo, and advertising. So it's absolutely fascinating. I wish I could say where it's going to be 10 years from now.
But I mean, one of the things that we've been talking about lately is that the social media here, at least, are beginning to mature a little bit. I mean, the social media reaction after the Newtown massacre and the social media, right. I mean, there was a lot more people weighing in and saying, wait a second, you're going out of bounds here.
That's right.
So is there any sign of self-modulation in China of the netizens kind of calling each other to task?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think there's a marketplace out there. If somebody puts out something that's way out of left field, other people will come out and attack it. I mean, that's kind of what Jefferson talked about, the marketplace of ideas. And there was a lot of criticism during the Boston Marathon bombings and the investigation after about false information. CNN put out false information, et cetera. The one advantage of this hyperactive 24/7 news cycle we're in is false information can get out there, but you can also correct it faster.
Right.
Yep.
Thank you for coming tonight. It's pretty
Thank you.
interesting. So, regarding censorship, and definitely going back to the events at Tiananmen Square, to my understanding, that's one of the biggest censored pieces of information. So, first question is there any information out there on Tiananmen Square for the people now? And also, looking at censorship in the future, is there any kind of, do you foresee any leniency or the end of censorship, if you will?
Yeah, two very good questions. Tiananmen Square is still one of the most heavily censored terms in China. There are only a few things that are going to be censored. I mean, usually anything involving the Dalai Lama, Falun Gong, and not only just Tiananmen Square, but if you try to type in the Google search or Baidu search, just even the initials, was it the June 10th, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, 610 or, June 4, sorry, 6-4 or any combination of that.
Or 1089, that's right.
That's right.
6 plus 4. Yeah.
6 plus 4 is, so any combination of, is really, really highly sensitive there. There has been speculation that the new leadership under Xi Jinping and the Prime Minister Li Keqiang maybe at some point about to look at or revise the verdict on Tiananmen Square. We don't know if that's true, but a lot of academics think that's the case. Li Keqiang, actually, the prime minister, actually had a lot of friends from his class at Peking University who were sympathetic with the Tiananmen Square protesters, and some people think he himself was sympathetic. So people are waiting to see. That's going to be, to me, the next big step in China, if they can come back and revise the verdicts on Tiananmen Square. I think they're a little reluctant to do that, because once you do that, then you open it up for lawsuits and all kinds of other stuff. But they're trying to rewrite that history very, very delicately. But no, that's a really still heavily censored term, because that's incredibly sensitive for them that the PLA opened fire on their own people. In general, I don't see them deliberately lifting. They're already changing censorship. There's a lot less censored now than there was probably in the 80s. You could talk about a lot more topics. You can talk about corruption. Xi Jinping talks about corruption now, so you can talk about corruption. You can talk about failings of the government. You can talk about, how they're not fixing the environment, the air pollution in Beijing, bird flu. It's just now it's narrowed down to direct criticisms of the leadership in Beijing by name and allegations of corruption against the leadership by name, and then questioning the rule of the Communist Party. Besides that, almost everything else is kind of fair game now, so, and it's actually not, the censorship there is not an active censorship, it's more of a passive censorship. You can start writing about things in the press until they tell you not to. So even on the Wenzhou train crash, there were all kinds of stories in the media the next day about the corruption in the ministry, whether the corruption was to blame for the high-speed rail system being built in a faulty way. The railroad minister was earlier sacked and held for corruption charges. All of that was open in the media. And it only got to a certain point where the censors put out a notice, which you could actually see saying, okay, tone it down, guys. Stop putting this stuff on the front page. So they kind of let it out there, as you said earlier. They let people let off steam, and then they kind of rein it in a little bit. So it's a far less censored place than it was 10 years ago.
And it probably, that whole Wenzhou thing probably caused the demise of one of the most powerful government agencies in the world, the Railway Ministry of China, was finally broken up in this last thing.
Absolutely.
But just real quick, you mentioned bird flu.
Right.
I mean, SARS was probably the thing that's the lesson there, right?
Absolutely, because, WHO was saying basically when you got an epidemic like that, you've got to get the information out there fast.
And for those of you who don't remember, 10 years ago in China, they had this thing called SARS, which was a really fast-growing, like a pneumonia for people. And there was a lot of quick transmission, and the government hushed it all up because they didn't want to create a panic, and they didn't. Anyway, and it just got completely out of hand. And everybody says that now that they've learned their lesson. So with this new bird flu, they've been much more open about it, and they've used social media proactively.
That's right.
To get out good information without frightening people.
That's right. Yeah, we got to keep the questions going and get everybody in.
First, I'd like to thank you. I learned a lot from your whole thing. And then one question I have is, how is social media affecting religion in China? Because I know like Christianity, they want to like suppress like Christianity and all that. So how is that changing? How is social media changing all that?
How is social media changing
religion?
Religion.
Christianity.
That's a good question. I'm not actually sure. I've thought about that a lot. There are a lot more, Chinese are becoming a lot more religious. And I think there's a social and spiritual void that people feel. I think, and I read a lot on social media and elsewhere about how people feel like they spent the last 30 years getting rich. And now that they're rich, they're looking for something else. I don't know if religious groups have gotten into that space because, quite frankly, a lot of religious groups want to keep a low profile in China. A lot of the churches are kind of underground churches, and they still kind of exist on the margins. So I'm not that's a good question. I think maybe social media could become an organizing tool for people who want to be religious, but I haven't seen that yet, and I think that's something the government would keep a little bit more wary eye on, if I'm not mistaken, but that's just my guess.
Right, thank you.
Thank you.
Final two questions.
Hi, my name is Lindsay Wyatt Jr. I am a political science major, and I'm 24 years old.
Okay.
I say that because when I look back at history, like at least my history, and I think about, I guess, influential people, I think about teachers, professors, individuals that have, I guess, worked hard for their positions and their influence, I guess, in the world. With that being said, considering the influence that people have with social media, do you feel as if, do you feel as if like it's right or wrong? Or like, do you feel as if we're heading in a good direction? And where do you see, I guess, the age of information going? With people with the access of I guess 300 million people like in Weibo, like where do you see that going in the future?
So, yeah, it's sort of like wisdom of crowds versus wisdom of the elite.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I mean, some people say that social media actually serves as a democratizing element because before, I mean, just even here, before it was, I mean, if you take a step back, before you got your news off of, when I was 24, you got your news from 3 major TV networks, ABC, CBS, and NBC, and then the New York Times, Washington Post, and AP, and that was kind of it. And then you had the growth of cable news, and then after that, you had kind of the, this proliferation of newspapers and magazines, and then Bloomberg didn't exist before, et cetera. And now with Weibo and social media, everybody's a journalist in a way. So some people say that's a democratizing factor. On the other hand, when you do have a major event like the elections last year, like the superstorm Sandy that came through, like the Boston Marathon bombings, I think you do see a tendency of people to try to go back to those traditional sources because there's so much clutter in the information field that CNN's ratings suddenly go up, and the Washington Post and the New York Times suddenly are selling more copies because people go back to a trusted news source because there's so much clutter out there. In terms of where things are going to go in the future, and to bring it back to China, again, I can't look into a crystal ball. Whether it's going to be a good thing or a bad thing, I think is almost not the right question because I just think we're in a new world and it's there and we can't change it. So we're just going to have to learn to live with it, for whatever it is. It's already changing the way we all live. It's already changed the way we all live. And by the way, if you're all students here, be very careful what you put on your Facebook pages because it will come back to haunt you. And if you get hired at any place for an internship or a government job or the Washington Post, they will go back and Google your name and look and see what you put on your Facebook page. So if you put too much stories on there about getting drunk or whatever, it will come back to haunt you. So all the stuff that you used to do in private, it's no longer private. It's already kind of out there. So
And by the way, people probably had conversations or asked questions like that back back in 1453 when Gutenberg's press democratized the spread of information for the first time.
Last question.
Last question.
Thanks. Yeah, and thank you for indulging so many questions. I can tell people are probably just going to start picking their stuff up pretty soon. But I just like to quickly ask, you mentioned that, censorship is sort of in a half-baked stage for this platform. They're letting some things go and then cracking down on some things and trying to find some ways to get in there. So what I want to ask is this, who has the upper hand here? Is the government actually afraid of this? Is this a market change? Or are they just sort of indulging the people in this platform?
That's a good question. Where does the government come down on this? I think the government I think it's a both. I mean, I think the government's terrified by the idea that the crowds, the masses, suddenly have a voice, that they have to suddenly take account of people's views and viewpoints. They're spending an enormous amount of resources now trying to keep track of what people are saying on social media because they see that as a potent force. On the other hand, I think they see that if they can harness that force for their favor, it might actually be something that could preserve their own grip on power for a while. So I think I don't think there's one monolithic view. I think we make a mistake here to think of Chinese or the Chinese government or the Chinese Communist Party even as one monolithic view. I think there's some in the party who say, this is terrifying, we have to control this thing, even stamp it out. And there are others who are saying, hold on, this is something we can use, this is a tool that we can use to organize people. So I think that's a debate that's playing out right now within the echelons of power in China. Some people think that the new leadership under Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang is modernistic enough to recognize that, as I just said in the answer to that question, it is the future, we can't change it, so let's just get on that horse and try to ride it. And some people are saying, yeah, but this is a tiger that can swallow us. So I think we're seeing that debate play out, which is why at the same time you see them getting into that space and putting up things like the Xi Jinping website, they're also, on the other hand, shutting down websites and arresting bloggers for what they put out. So I don't think they've quite figured it out as a unified government yet. I think there are factions within the government who can go either way on any given day.
Great, thank you.
Thanks for the question.
Thank you, Keith. That was great.
Thank you. Thank you all.